Welcome back. In a moment, we'll continue our discussion on the pressures of education. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. At least a dozen people have been killed in another mudslide in Sri Lanka, around 65 kilometres east of the capital, Colombo, taking the death toll in the country to more than 200 people. Torrential rain has caused widespread flooding and landslides in the past week, in what officials say is the country's worst disaster since the 2004 tsunami. Demonstrators have taken to the streets of Morocco for a fifth night, demanding the release of activist Nasser Zefzafi. The 39-year-old has organised months of protests against unemployment and corruption. He's been charged with threatening national security. And Facebook has apologised for removing the profile picture of a Hong Kong activist which contained text referencing the Tiananmen Square massacre. Fung Ka-kyung's photo called for an end to dictatorial rule in China. The 1989 massacre in Tiananmen Square claimed the lives of hundreds of activists and remains a highly sensitive issue in the country. Back now to our discussion on education. Earlier we looked at the stress put on children to pass exams, but for many families, simply getting access to decent education is a pressure all of its own. A year ago, South Africa's education minister said its school system was in a state of crisis. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Rajni Naidu, who is the director of the International Centre for Higher Education Management. Previously, she was involved in developing models for higher education in South Africa. Rajni, thanks very much indeed for joining us. First of all, do you remember Africa's system was in a state of crisis a year ago?
Yes.
Has much changed since then?
I think there are very many attempts to change the South African, both the secondary school system and the higher education system. If we look back all the way through since apartheid, there have been huge transformations, all going in the right direction. But at the same time, the sheer numbers of students, the lack of resources, a highly unequal society, all has very major consequences on education as well.
I suppose back in the days of the Rainbow Nation being born, everyone thought this thing will take care of itself. This will evolve into a happier, more just society. And in each layer, whether it's the military or commerce or mining or health and safety or medicine and, of course, also education, it's proving perhaps more difficult than people thought.
Yes, it's, I think if I can talk about higher education and the university system, there has been a major change. So when I was a student in South Africa, the universities were racially segregated. You had to go, if you were white, you went to a white university, which was very elite. If you were African, you went to some of the worst under-resourced universities that were completely state-controlled. And of course, that has changed. We now have a comprehensive university system, and you can go to any university. It doesn't depend upon race anymore, but it depends upon how much money you have. So that's now the big problem. It's an economic problem. Poor students can't afford to go to university. One of my PhD students was saying to me that his mother works as a cleaner. She leaves home at 4:30 in the morning. She comes back at 6:30. She's worked for 20 years, and she can't afford the fees for university education.
And university students have been protesting about exactly that, haven't they?
They have, yes. The protest has taken many forms. Firstly, it's again about inequality. So some of the students are protesting about the fact that universities have raised their fees. There's no, fees in South Africa are not regulated. So universities can charge very different fees. So fees have gone up. They're also wanting universities or the government to actually help students who are very poor with bursaries, scholarships, loans and living expenses. If you look at the rural areas, students in South African rural areas are hungry. They're actually starving.
What about the universities and what they're getting from the schools? I mean, they need a certain intake, they need a certain level of education in order to educate children further through further education. You've mentioned the problems of money. There's also those problems, those apartheid problems of infrastructure, transportation, where people live, what opportunities, how they move around and so on. Are the schools, do you feel, rising to the challenge of presenting South African universities with the right kind of students to pick up with?
The schools are very, they're not segregated by ethnicity as much as class. So you have students from middle class families who are black who go to some of the best schools. You also have students who are going to very, very poorly resourced schools. So these are students from poor families. They come from a family where there hasn't been that much higher education, so they're underprepared from their family in the first place. They then go to schools which are very poorly resourced, and they then can't enter universities because they don't have the right school scores. And the universities can blame the schools can blame the universities, but I think something has to happen at both at the school level, but also at the university level. And universities need to test much more for potential rather than just to look at merit in the usual way.
Of course, apartheid was a classic system that killed aspiration in young people. Are you seeing at least a growth in aspiration in parts of South African society? People can just make it. There is a chance to do something that perhaps their parents couldn't do.
Yes. When you talk to students, including the students who are protesting, it's not about not having a belief in higher education or being disillusioned. They believe in higher education. They believe that universities are for the public good. So they're not struggling just for themselves. They say they're struggling for future generations. And what they want is a fairer higher education system that everyone can enter, but also universities that make them feel at home. Universities that also reflect their identities, their language, their culture.
So look beyond the borders of South Africa then and look at the big international universities around the world. Is there anything that those big establishments could now learn perhaps from this new fledgling higher education system in South Africa that they've perhaps forgotten in the years?
I think it's in South Africa, there's still a spirit of we can change this. Universities can change. Universities can be something else. We can learn from our past. We can look to the future and we can develop different models. Whereas when you look at the rest of the world, it really feels as if there is quite a static hierarchy of institutions, where institutions are doing things very much in the way that they've always done things.
And that's surely problematic because society is moving so fast now with technology and the changing work practices and so on, that perhaps there's a danger that even that final step, the graduate, undergraduate, postgraduate levels of education could fall behind what the modern world needs from those youngsters.
I think if we go back to some of the more traditional types of education that universities wanted to develop in students, for example, critical thinking, critical understanding, global citizenship, those sorts of traditional educational aspects are still as important today as they were previously. I think one of the problems with universities is that they've all moved into what I call a competition fetish. So universities are competing. They're competing to go up in rankings. In England, we have a research excellence framework. We have a teaching excellence framework. And I think there's so much competition that there's not enough collaboration, both at the national level as well as at the global level. So we have world-class universities in different countries, all competing with each other. And I think these world-class universities should actually have the responsibility to develop their own domestic systems as well, because they gain the lion's share of resources.
Okay, Rajni Naidu, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on
Thank you.
Insight. We end, of course, with our Insight Bite, a little something we feel that you should know. Train passengers in Kenya are taking advantage of a new rail link between Nairobi and Mombasa, which has cut the journey by almost 2/3. The Chinese-funded line is Kenya's first new major railway in more than a century. Passengers will now be able to travel between the two cities in 4.5 hours for less than $10 US. That's cheaper than the country's bus service. It's hoped further track will soon be laid to connect Mombasa with South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi. That's all for now. I'm Andrew Wilson, and that was Insight.